This is Duke University.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on a rainy day to see this presentation. I really appreciate having everyone here. I'm really grateful to the Franklin Humanities Institute for welcoming me back, and also for the time that I was here in the spring. It was actually 2012 semester, but the time that I was here was very rewarding and enriching, and I'm very excited that the book is finally out. So before I get started, I just wanted to kind of get a feel for who's in the room. So can you raise your hand if any of these applied? If you are an undergraduate, can you raise your hand? Okay. If you are faculty, can you raise your hand? If you are just from the wider community, can you raise your hand? Okay. If you've been to Brazil, can you raise your hand? If you want to go to Brazil, can you raise your hand? Okay, everyone. If you're studying Portuguese, can you raise your hand? Okay, great. Tudo bom? Tudo bem. Okay. So I wanted to start out just talking a little bit about how I got into this project, right? Why this book? Why did I go into this research? So it all really started when I was an undergraduate. I studied abroad in Brazil. I was an undergraduate at New York University, and I studied abroad in Brazil my senior year in college. And I spent 5 weeks in Sao Paulo and then 5 months in Salvador through the CIEE study abroad program. I had a very interesting experience in Salvador, Bahia. I saw a lot of interesting couples, is what I would call them, of older European men with very young Afro-Brazilian women who were about my age at the time. And I was very perplexed or curious about these couples. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing that happened when I was studying abroad was I had an experience on the beach where I was with another African-American woman, and we would always speak Portuguese to each other in public so that we can blend in and pass as Bahian, or try to. And so we were speaking Portuguese to each other on the beach, and these Italian men approached us and started making small talk in Portuguese. So we were talking to them, and within about 5 minutes of talking to them, they were trying to bring us back to their hotel rooms. And at this point, my friend and I turned to each other and addressed each other in English, and we were kind of bewildered at who do they think we are? Why do they think that this is appropriate? And when they heard us speaking English, they quickly said in English, "Oh my goodness, we're so sorry. We didn't know you were American. We thought you were Brazilian." And so this moment kind of made me think, well, if we were Brazilian, does that mean that we are available and we are just ready to go back to their hotel rooms within 5 minutes of conversation? So it kind of, the questions resulting from this visceral experience ignited my intellectual curiosity about sex tourism in Salvador. And I wondered how assumptions of Black hypersexuality have come to characterize foreign tourists' imaginaries of Brazil as a racial sexual paradise. These questions persisted after I returned back to the US. And I noticed that whenever I would tell, particularly heterosexual men that I had been in Brazil, they would often have comments like, "Oh, I've heard about the women there," or something to that effect, right? So I wondered, how are, foreigners, Americans, Europeans imagining Brazil, and particularly in terms of sexuality. And I'll talk about this. Actually, I should mention this picture was a graffiti image that is used a couple years ago when you walk into Pelourinho, which is a neighborhood in the historic center of Salvador. There was this image of an Italian man. You can tell, he has the Italian flag. He's saying "ciao" and "benvenuti," which is welcome in Italian. And I'll talk a little bit later about why I thought this image was significant. And now, I was just back there this summer, and it's now been painted over. But I thought this was a very significant image to have, this kind of representation of a foreign tourist in Salvador. So one of the things that I look at in the book is, how Brazil is marketed, right? So we see in this image, produced by Embratur, we see the caption that says, "A long time ago, I was seduced by Brazil." There's another advertisement, a 2002 Embratur advertisement featured exotic round fruits with the caption that read, "Paradise exists, and with no forbidden fruit. Come to Brazil and get away from your tensions." So there's a way in which sensuality and seduction is very much present in the kind of marketing, the way that Brazil has been marketed since about the 70s. So these examples highlight how women's sexuality is used to market Brazil as a tourism destination. But in the case of Bahia, which I'll talk about the particularities of Bahia, being that it's considered the Black Mecca, it's a place where the population of African descent is very large, the tourism propaganda is racialized in a particular way. So my experience on the beach and thinking about, these experiences revealed the ways in which notions of Black hypersexuality that circulate in Bahia's touristscape created a situation in which any presumed Black Brazilian woman was seen as sexually available. And Kia Caldwell, who's an anthropologist at UNC Chapel Hill, she writes about in her book, Negatives in Brazil, that diasporic anthropologists are often subjected to many of the same racialized and gendered discourses and practices that we set out to examine in our research. So that's one of the things that I definitely, my entry point to this research had to do with that. So why Brazil and why Bahia? So although sex tourism is something that occurs in many parts of the world, Thailand, the Philippines, Cuba, Dominican Republic, many countries, Brazil is a significant site of sex tourism in the world. Yet there's a surprising dearth in scholarship or information published about this topic, about sex tourism in Brazil. So my book is actually the first full-length ethnography or monograph of sex tourism in Brazil published in English. There's been some writing in Portuguese, but nothing yet has been published in English. And Bahia, the state of Bahia is unique. So there's a map, if you're not familiar, Brazil is a very large country, and Bahia is in the northeast, and then this is, breaking down the state of Bahia. And Bahia has 950 kilometers of coastline. Bahia is unique because it's marketed as the Black Mecca, right? 75 to 80% of the population is of African descent. It has one of the highest unemployment rates in the country and very high levels of inequality. There was a study done a few years ago that said that income disparities are greater within the metropolitan region of Salvador than in Brazil as a whole. So for instance, a resident in the richest area of Salvador earns 25 times more than a resident in the poorest area of Salvador, right? And in Brazil as a whole, this difference is only 5 times, right? So a resident of the richest area of Brazil earns 5 times more than a resident of the richest area of Brazil, the poorest area of Brazil, sorry. So the northeast of Brazil, this region up here, I don't have a pointer, but this is seen as a pretty much underdeveloped region, but it's leading the nation in tourism development. And Salvador is the 3rd largest tourism destination in Brazil and the largest tourism destination in the northeast. So Bahia Tursa, which is Bahia's state tourism agency, markets Bahia as the Terra da Felicidade. Any Portuguese students know what that means? Terra da Felicidade, the land of happiness. Okay, so this is also important in terms of thinking about how Brazil is marketed, and Bahia in particular. So here's a tourist map of Salvador, and what's interesting about this map is that, okay, we have Pelourinho here in the center. I'll show you some images of Pelourinho as well. Then we have the coastline. So Bahia is a very popular tourist destination, and then all along the coastline, Rio Vermelho, which isn't listed here, but it's right here, before Manalina, Itapuã. So all of these, the whole coastline is very prominent in terms of the tourist landscape. But in the area in the middle, which is green, people actually live there, right? A lot of low-income Afro-Brazilian people live there, but on the tourist map, it's kind of not really indicated. It just kind of looks like a forest or looks like a empty land, but people actually live there. So I wanted to just mention 3 things. So one is I want to talk a little bit about the theoretical perspectives of my work, then a little bit about the methods, and then a little bit about the goals before I get into the arguments and the kind of breakdown of the book. So in terms of theoretical perspectives, do we have any anthropology majors in the room? Okay, so this may be new. Okay, we have one anthropologist. So this may be a little new for some of you. So I'm thinking about this topic through a perspective called the anthropology of globalization, right? We've all heard about globalization, but one of the things about the anthropology of globalization is that it tries to be attentive to human agency, to imagination, and to the practices of everyday life, right? So instead of looking at globalization from a kind of macro or top-down perspective, thinking about, structural adjustment or, different kind of programs and policies or transnational corporations, instead of looking at it from that level, it looks at it on the ground, like for people's everyday lives. How are people dealing with the effects of globalization, right? So that's one of the kind of undergirding perspectives of the book. It also tries to advance an intersectional, transnational, Black feminist approach to sex tourism that's deeply influenced by feminist anthropology, queer studies, and activist anthropology. And so, for instance, there's an anthropologist named Florence Babb, who teaches in Florida, who's written on sex tourism in Cuba and Nicaragua. And she called for the need for more detailed ethnographic studies that examine the nuances of socially and historically situated sex and romance tourism. And so this is one of the things that I hope that this work will do. So in terms of methods, what the kind of research I did was ethnography, which is the type of research that anthropologists particularly like to do. It involves participant observation, so really being in the spaces, in the touristscape, going to activities promoted for tourists, just kind of being there, being present for a long time. I did 18 months of research between 2005 and 2008 when I was a graduate student at Stanford. I also did some archival research in the Bahia archives. Bahia, again, is the state tourism development agency, and they have archives on the kind of propaganda and statistics and things like that about tourism in Salvador. I also analyzed visual images and representations of Salvador as a tourist destination, and particularly focused on some of the sexualized images of Bahia that are perpetuating the tourism industry, that I'll show some of these today. I worked with two women's organizations, one called APROSBA, which was the Sex Workers Association in Bahia, and the other was called SHAMI, or the Humanitarian Center for the Support of Women, which is a local NGO that works to raise awareness about sex tourism and trafficking. So I worked with them, I volunteered, I did interviews with many of the people involved in those organizations. So as a whole, I did a lot of interviews with people ranging from foreign tourists, tourism industry workers and cultural producers, sex workers, as well as people who didn't identify as sex workers, but they also had some kind of ambiguous liaisons with foreign tourists, and also government and civil society, people who represented government and civil society campaign efforts to eradicate sex tourism and trafficking. So a few of the goals for the book, I really wanted to write a book that would be accessible to a wide variety of people. I wanted to write a book that would be accessible for undergraduates, for scholarly and lay audiences alike, because I believe that this is an important topic, and it's going to be increasingly important as we look at events coming up, such as the World Cup in 2014 in Brazil, Summer Olympics in 2016. So I think this is something that we really need to kind of pay attention to. I also wanted to complicate the sensationalist narratives about sex tourism that often circulate in the media. So, I actually have a few articles that I can pass around later that, sex tourism is often represented in a particular way. And with the research that I did, I kind of uncovered some different stories around that, right, that kind of complicate that narrative. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. I also wanted to just present multiple perspectives on a phenomenon that has garnered tremendous worldwide media attention in general. And I would say one of the biggest regrets of the book was that I was unable to include a lot of images. So I had, and I'll show you some of these today since they're not in the book, but because of either copyright issues or image quality issues, I wasn't able to include some of the images. So I will show some of these images today. So in terms of a few of the major arguments, before I get into okay, so that's the table of contents. A few of the major arguments, I wanted to read just one part in terms of how I'm conceptualizing sex tourism. So on page 11, I say, sex tourism does not constitute a new phenomenon, but is actually a transnational reiteration of processes that have occurred historically in Brazil. The eroticization of women of African descent had a long history within Brazil before these images circulated transnationally. Scholars must understand the historical context in which Black women's sexuality has been constructed. Gloria Becker, Murray Miller-Young, and other scholars of Black women's sexuality have grappled with the question of how to study and write about the subject without re-pathologizing an already stigmatized and marginalized population. We must take seriously Black women's expressions of sexual agency and autonomy, even in the context of the phenomenon of sex tourism, which is often considered the epitome of exploitation and subjugation. And I'll just stop there. So another thing that, many scholars of sex tourism have noted that sex tourism is actually not an anomaly, right? It's not an aberration. It's actually something that's part and parcel of the tourism industry. It's merely one strand of the gendered tourism industry in which sexual services are part of the range of informal services that are available. And that's something that became really evident to me as I was doing interviews with tour guides and Afro-Brazilian cultural producers, dance teachers, who often felt implicated, right? They felt that their tour guides, for instance, had clients who had an expectation that part of their job or part of their responsibility was to procure women or to find, to be able to help them have these liaisons, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about that later, but there was a way in which this was kind of pervasive and throughout the tourism industry. Another argument that I make that is somewhat unique in terms of the scholarship on sex tourism. One of the things about Bahia, because it's marketed as the Black Mecca, there's a way in which the cultural and sexual economies of tourism are inextricably linked in Salvador's tourism industry. So the Bahian state government uses an eroticized blackness and Afro-Brazilian culture to sell Bahia to foreign tourists. So while government and civil society campaigns tend to define sex tourism as something that happens when the state turns away its watchful eye, my research suggests that something different is actually happening in Salvador. So the eroticization and commodification of Black culture and Black bodies creates a situation where the tourist desires for exotic culture and erotic, hypersexualized Black bodies are often inextricable. Thus, Salvador is characterized by both the lure of Afro-Brazilian cultural heritage as well as the possibilities of sex. So that's another thing I'll go into. I'll give you some examples of that later. I just wanted to highlight the major arguments. Another one of the arguments of the book is talking about the specter of sex tourism. So this is something that I discovered in the field when basically that there's broad and wide-ranging implications of sex tourism that go far beyond just sex workers and sex tourists, right? That the meanings and implications of sex tourism for daily life, romantic relationships, and transnational mobility are really significant. So sex tourism, the phenomenon, kind of creates anxiety about the validity and authenticity of relationships, of romantic relationships between foreign tourists and Bahians. And sex tourism profoundly affects how people relate to each other across transnational borders. So I'll also give examples of that later. And then the subtitle of the book, Ambiguous Entanglements. What I'm really trying to get at there is this idea that, excuse me, just getting over a cold. This idea that there's a broad range, that sex tourism includes a broad range of liaisons and relationships forged in the touristscape of Salvador. That sexual relations move beyond mere commercial exchanges to encompass intimate and emotional exchanges as well. So those are just a few of, just highlighting a few of the arguments, and then I'll go into detail with ethnographic examples later in the talk. So again, we have, sex tourism not really being a new phenomenon. It's kind of reproducing things that have already kind of happened in the national context of Brazil. This idea that sex tourism is not an anomaly, but it's actually kind of pervasive and a part of the gender tourism industry. This idea that cultural and sexual tourism are linked and connected rather than being, distinct. That the specter of sex tourism is one of the big kind of issues or, effects of this issue. And then the idea of ambiguous entanglements. So in terms of the chapters, you see the table of contents there. Chapter 1 kind of goes into detail with how Bahia has been marketed in the international tourism industry as the Black Mecca, and also explores the shifts in how Blackness and Afro-Brazilian culture have been treated by the state over time. And I also highlight, each chapter opens with a kind of ethnographic anecdote, like anthropologists love to do. I open with the story of what they call casa gringas. And casa gringas are usually Afro-Brazilian men in Bahia who, the name means like hunt foreign women. So they're called hunters or pega turistas, which is grab tourists. So they're these men who use their cultural expertise as well as, to try to have relationships with foreign tourists, right? With foreign tourists, women and sometimes men. So I open with some examples of casa gringas. And chapter 2 lays the foundation for understanding Brazilian ideologies of race that shape the sexual economies of tourism. And it also explores the racialized erotics of tourism propaganda and discusses how the specter of sex tourism affects Black women who are not sex workers, but who are often mistaken as sex workers or assumed to be sex workers because of these assumptions of Black hypersexuality. Chapter 3 draws upon interviews with tour guides and tourism industry workers. It also presents a case study of Italian men who are constructed as quintessential sex tourists. And it talks about the structure and parameters of the sex tourism industry in Salvador. Chapter 4 focuses in on 2 particular male sex tourists or tourists that I interviewed. Chapter 5 focuses on APROSBA, which is the Sex Workers Association, and it kind of goes into the roles and activities of the association. I just wanted to read a description of APROSBA. Okay, I'll get to that in a minute. So for APROSBA members' stories of empowerment, police violence, romantic dreams, and complex desires challenged much of what is written about sex tourism in sensationalist media coverage. These women told me stories of falling in love with foreign ship workers, of traveling to visit their clients' home countries, of escaping police violence and abuse by domestic clients in the arms of a gringo cariñoso, a caring, affectionate foreign man who gave them access to their own city in a way that they had never before experienced. How was I to make sense of these complicated stories of affect, desire, strategy, and risk that did not fit into the conventional narratives of a phenomenon that has been considered the dark side of tourism? These women's stories raise new questions about what exactly this transnational phenomenon entails and what impact it has on the lives of Brazilian women and men. Is sex tourism simply a manifestation of geopolitical, racial, and gender inequality, sexual exploitation, and the excesses of consumption and mass tourism? Or is something else going on here? This book works through some of these questions. So chapter 6 highlights it also explores APROSBA, but it goes more in detail with some of the ambiguities implicit in APROSBA members' sexual and romantic encounters with foreign men. It also goes into a discussion of the racial politics of APROSBA. Chapter 7 focuses on state and NGO campaigns to eradicate sex tourism, and talks about how they often conflate sex tourism with trafficking, which is something that I argue is important not to do. It's kind of dangerous to conflate these two terms. And then the conclusion, of course, raises questions and implications for future research on issues of race, sexuality, and globalization. So now I want to just go a little bit, give you some ethnographic examples of some of the things that I'm talking about. So this is an image of Pelourinho, which is in, it's known as a World Heritage Site, UNESCO World Heritage Site. And what I wanted to highlight this image right here, because this is basically a tourist thing. So this is the image of a baiana and a capoeirista, right? So a person doing capoeira, and you can't see, but this is an Afro wig. And usually the person is their turban that they put on. So people will stand there and say, hey, come take a picture of a capoeirista and a baiana. And, so you'll see like white middle class people going to don this Afro wig and, turban. And it's known as, it's like a touristic kind of photo op. But what I thought was interesting about this example is how Afro-Brazilian culture is kind of, commodified and marketed as, this something that's quaint and cute to do while you're on vacation, right? So again, Salvador is unique in that it's the only destination that is situated unequivocally as a site of Afro-Brazilian cultural tourism. And I just wanted to quote from one tour guide, an Afro-Brazilian tour guide who I interviewed, Joseval, it's his pseudonym, but Joseval, he says, Black culture is the great attraction that makes Bahia third in the national tourism ranking. If you take away African culture, Bahia has nothing. And another quote, he says, racism in Bahia is very perverse. It's hidden. They like Black culture, but don't accept Black people. Black culture is okay, but Black people, no. This culture is sucked dry, but Black people remain poor. And as Christopher Dunn notes, I'll quote him, he says, the representation of Salvador as a Black city has not diminished the forms of racial exclusion and violence that have adversely affected the Black community of Salvador. So these images, this one is actually from a pamphlet produced by Bahia Tursa that has kind of tips for tourists, right? And I thought it was very interesting that this is the image of the tourists that they have. And just so you know, there are many African-American women who go to Bahia, right? It's almost like a mecca for African-American women, for African-Americans in general, as Europeans, Italians, everyone. But this is the image of the kind of typical tourist that they chose to highlight. And you'll notice this hat with the kind of braid extensions and the red, yellow, and green. It's a Olodum, the Afro-Brazilian band, produces these hats. So this is a mannequin in one of the tourist shops in Pelourinho that also has the kind of Olodum gear on. So that's just one example of the way in which, black culture is for sale in Bahia. So in terms of, I want to talk a little bit about, show you some examples of the racialized erotics of tourism propaganda. So has anyone read Jorge Amado, novelist? Jorge Amado was a novelist from Bahia. He's written many, many books that have been translated in many, many languages. So one of his novels, Gabriela, Clove, and Cinnamon, has been translated into 49 languages. It has contributed to how black Brazilian women, Afro-Brazilian women, are perceived and treated in Brazilian society. And it's also played a role in shaping images of black women that are exported abroad. So basically in this novel, you have this image of the mulata, this mixed race woman who's considered the national, the image of desire, the icon of erotic desire. She's seen as someone who's not good for marrying. You can't marry her because she's too wild and promiscuous, but she's just, so this very sexualized image that's kind of become, the mainstream. And at a certain point in the 1930s and 1940s, Brazil, they were really promoting this image of the mulata abroad, and even considered the mulata the only thing worth exporting abroad. The best export product was seen as the mulata. So there's a large history. This is what I want to get at when I talk about how sex tourism is just a transnational reiteration of what was already happening in the national context of Brazil. So why am I bringing up this novel? Well, this image that I'm showing you is actually a pamphlet. So it's for Ilhéus, which is a town in southern Bahia. It's not Salvador, but it's further south. And this pamphlet also had a video advertisement that was produced by Bahian state tourism authorities. I found this in the Bahia Tourista archives. So this video shows how eroticized representations of Brazilian women of African descent are deployed within tourism propaganda. So I just want to, describe the video. So this video shows scenic landscape views of beautiful, pristine beaches with the sensual, whispering voice of a female narrator who tells her audience, "You're going to fall in love for sure." So nature is feminized and characterized as wild, untamed, and alluring. The woman's voice, the narrator's voice, refers to the sensuality in the clove and cinnamon skin color as one appealing aspect of your potential visit to Ilhéus. Finally, the narrator says, "Now you have an obligation, but with no obligations. Come, get to know me better. Live a romance with me. You won't be able to resist. It's a pleasure to meet you." The tone of her voice emphasizes prazer, pleasure, in a way that connotes an underlying yet obvious sexual innuendo. As the narrator utters these words, we see the image of a cinnamon-colored woman walking along the beach, her long mane of unruly black hair blowing in the wind as she sways her hips from side to side. Wearing a sarong and bikini top, she enters the water and splashes, throwing her hair back. In the final scene, she indulges in a playful yet warm embrace with the white man. And images like this, you see the way Bahia is kind of marketing, itself to tourists, have real implications, right? So, for instance, when I was a graduate student at Stanford, there was a Brazilian professor who's from Sao Paulo, and she told me a story where, she met a European man on a bus going to Santos, another city, a coastal city in Sao Paulo state. And when she asked him what was he doing in Brazil, what brought him to Brazil, he said, "I came searching for my Gabriela." So he was looking for her. He was looking for this woman represented in the video advertisement. So, so this is just one example of how these eroticized representations kind of permeate the tourist imaginary. This is another example of not the tourist imaginary, but again, the local, domestic thing. This is an ad that I found where it's kind of advertising this folkloric show, authentic Bahian mulatas, live music daily, traditional cooking, traditional and international cooking, tem mulata na tenda. So this is an example of, not only was Sargentelli doing these, these international shows de mulatas with samba dancing women in Europe and also in Rio, but this is happening in Bahia as well. This is another, I'm going to show a couple of the postcards that I found over the years in Bahia. So this is one that the caption, what I think is most interesting about this picture is that, seeing a empty beach in Bahia is so rare Beaches are like crowded, people go with their families, they're drinking beer, listening to music. It's very much a community kind of scene. So to see a pristine, empty beach with just this woman, it's almost like an invitation, like come to Bahia, this is what you're gonna see. You're gonna have the beach all to yourself, and there's this beautiful woman right here. What I think is also interesting about this image is that the caption only says the north coast of Bahia. So it totally erases the presence of this woman, right? This is an image that I found that was also a poster for Pan Am Airlines circa 1970, and it was being auctioned online by Swan Galleries. And the description on the website reads, Oba Oba dancers from Oswaldo Sargentelli's nightclub in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, wearing 10-inch heels and not much else. Sargentelli, the famed sambista, brought mulatto dancers to the world's attention in the late 1960s. Here, Pan Am forgoes traditional travel images in favor of a more prurient advertising strategy. So again, this is kind of like the representation that Brazil has been promoting of itself. Another postcard that has, a young black woman's image, face in the image of Brazil, and there's a quote from Patrick Larvey. Brazil's tourist industry promotes the country as one which offers sexual attractions as part of the nation's natural and cultural resources. And these are more explicit images from Bahia. And these postcards are readily available at any newsstand on the street. While you can buy a newspaper or a magazine, or you can buy a postcard like this. And what's interesting about this one, I don't know if you can see the black dot, that's actually a fly, and the caption on the image says, "The fly with no shame." So, I don't want to leave, those images up there for too long, but, these postcards show how Salvador is marketed to the world as the Black Mecca, where blackness is eroticized and sold as a tourist commodity. These examples of tourism propaganda reveal how Brazil is often marketed as the land of samba and sensuality. From the 1930s, or I've talked about that a little bit, how the mulatta became an idealized figure from the 1930s onward. I'm going to skip over some things. So this is an image from SHAMI, the Centro Humanitário de Apoio à Mulher, so this humanitarian center for the support of women, which was an organization based in Salvador that worked to raise awareness about sex tourism and trafficking. And they had a lot of educational materials and pamphlets and brochures about this issue. So I thought this was the cover of one of their pamphlets. I thought was very interesting because it shows this kind of racialized relationship. It's transnational, and it shows this woman who's seems in love, like she's ready to go, she's ready to take the leap, and he's kind of welcoming her in. But as Shami brochures and pamphlets often reveal, perhaps there's other risks going on. What will happen when she gets there, But I wanted to end a little bit with a short discussion about Prosba. So this was the local sex workers association. It was the only organization in Bahia run by and for prostitutes. Some of their goals were to combat violence, to deal with HIV/AIDS prevention, to eradicate stigma, and to fight for their rights. Right. So they wanted to improve their working conditions. It's important to note that adult prostitution, is legal in Brazil. What is illegal is child prostitution, also, pimping, like benefiting from the sexual labor of someone else is illegal. So this organization, the president, Fabiana, she says that, we want to show that prostitutes are also dignified people who exercise a profession like any other. And so that's the logo of Afro-Brazilian, and it's very interesting. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the racial politics of the association, where we have this image that is kind of like a white Brazilian woman, whereas and a lot of the leadership of the organization was white as well, whereas the majority of the members were Afro-Brazilian. And even among the black sex workers, they had suffered different kinds of discrimination. So for instance, they were often asked to do domestic work along with sex work from foreign clients. And even, Fabiana, who was white, she noticed that black sex workers suffer more, they're often arrested, and she's able to walk away free, because there's not the expectation that she is a sex worker. So I have more stories. And I also wanted to highlight this. These are some of the educational kind of brochures that Prospa has done. They have this Amor que Cuida, love takes care, right? So it has a berimbau, so it's using Afro-Brazilian culture. This berimbau is the instrument that's played in capoeira, and putting a condom on that. So kind of trying to do a local cultural way of raising awareness about the importance of safer sex. and also the Without Shame project of fighting for our rights. That was a kind of national project that APROSA was a part of. So I didn't even get into the discussion of, one of the men who I interviewed who was a sex tourist, but if you have questions about that, I can talk about that. But I just wanted to end with, thinking about what are the implications of this? What does this mean? And so one quote that I really like from Policing Pleasure, this edited volume, edited by Susan Dewey and Patty Kelly, they say, ethnography's greatest potential contribution to public policy lies in its ability to represent the everyday realities of life for individuals who often constitute a population invisible to policymakers. So that's kind of, one of the things that I hope to be able to contribute to with this book. And I also just wanted to mention that APROSBA, there's been some changes since this book came out, right? APROSBA has now shut down due to lack of funding. And they had really important partnerships with the Ministry of Health. They were able to distribute free condoms to sex workers. They were able to raise awareness about police violence and all kinds of things. So now they're no longer there. So it's really kind of concerning in terms of what will happen there. And also with the, as I mentioned before, the World Cup coming this summer, the Summer Olympics coming in 2016. There's a lot of mobilization and a lot of panic in some ways about what this means. And the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women is an organization that published a report. They've been doing work for decades on these issues. They're based out of Asia. They released a report in 2011 that actually countered the idea that big sporting events lead to increased trafficking and prostitution, right? They said that there's actually no evidence that large sporting events cause an increase in trafficking or prostitution. So, it's important to kind of keep our eyes on what's happening and, how people's rights are being affected and, how their lives are being affected in this issue. And so I just wanted to close with a quote from a hip-hop group in Salvador that, I don't know if you were all paying attention this past summer. There was a lot of protests in Brazil about, the spending for the World Cup. A lot of state governments were putting all this money into building stadiums, and, meanwhile, the bus fares were increasing. People are, not having access to health care and different, there's a lot of inequality in Brazil. So there's this hip-hop group named Simples Reportagem in Salvador, and they wrote a song called My Praise for the Manifestations. And I just want to quote a few lines because I think it highlights some of the issues of tourism and inequality in Bahia. So they say, I would like to be a tourist here in my city, to be treated with a bit of dignity. I would like to be a tourist here in my country, to see if at least I would be able to be happy. The most popular carnival in the world, because it's made for the world and not for me. I am forgotten in the background. I'm not received with Bonfim ribbons, police carrying gringos' luggage. For them, camarotes with the finest buffets, and our children selling peanuts. So I'll stop there. Thank you.